Before this episode begins, we urge you to take a look at the Jazz Omnibus, the 600-page anthology of 21st century photos and writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, available online and wherever books are sold. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association, where we discuss news and views from those in the jazz media, writers, broadcasters, photographers, videographers, and other professionals documenting the entire ecosystem of jazz. I'm Rick Mitchell, a longtime jazz journalist, broadcaster, and JJA board member. Today on The Buzz, we are going to be talking with three of the most knowledgeable jazz radio professionals in the business. Ed Trefizger is the publisher of JazzWeek, which was founded in 2001 and publishes the weekly jazz radio airplay chart with reports from stations in the U.S. and Canada. He's a former jazz radio host at WGMC in Rochester, New York, and in addition to JazzWeek, his main occupation is as Chief Operating Officer and Partner in Genesee Media, which owns 5 radio stations and 5 translators in Western New York. He is also the longtime play-by-play broadcaster for the Rochester Institute of Technology men's Division I NCAA hockey team. Kayonne Riley is a station manager of WUCF, Orlando, Florida, a full-time jazz radio station offering straight-ahead jazz on their HD1 service and Latin jazz on the HD2 service. In addition to her management duties, Kayonne is the weekday midday jazz host, serves as the station's music director, and teaches the radio programming production podcast class for the Nicholson School of Communication at the University of Central Florida. She is the producer and host of Live from Studio A, a concert series featuring visiting jazz artists and groups. Scott Handley is the general manager of WZUM AM/FM, the full-time jazz station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A JJA member, Scott has been broadcasting for more than 40 years, including managing NPR stations in Pittsburgh, Birmingham, Alabama, and other places. He was on the NPR board for 6 years in the mid-2000s, is president of the Association of Public Radio Engineers, and has been a beat reporter and news director. He's a weekend host on WZUM in Pittsburgh and is also heard on stations across the country on the Pub Jazz service. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kayonne and Ed, you are both very involved in jazz radio and have been for decades. What are 2 or 3 of the biggest differences from 2000 to today for jazz radio?
One of the biggest changes, I think, happened in 2001 on September 11th, when a lot of stations went to full-time news coverage, and many of them did not come back and stayed as a single format news service or drastically cut back music. But since then, we've seen some other things. We've seen a continued attrition of stations doing only music to doing just news, or maybe stations that had news and music doing that. So I think we've seen something like probably a 25% reduction over those years in jazz stations. There are things that have changed in media overall, too. The advent of social media, for example, was not part of the equation. And then I think the thing that's the biggest one, and I know that's something Kayonne will be familiar with, back in 2000, it might be something that a listener would be delighted to hear or really excited to hear, something they hadn't heard in a while, whether it's Charles Mingus or Horace Silver or something like that, that a station might play that would be rare or not heard very often. Now, if somebody wants to hear Mingus or Horace, they can just go to one of the streaming services and hear it whenever they are. So I think that also changes the role of radio a bit.
On that, I would add that the 1996 telecommunications changes where consolidation was possible. It really changed the Orlando market, and it probably changed the markets where all of you guys are as well. Here in Orlando, we just saw a lot of the variety go away, and a lot of the music stations went away. Our main competitor was a smooth jazz station here in town, and they went away. Some of the old line contemporary hit radio has consolidated. And so there's just less choices for music lovers to listen if they're lazy like me and they don't want to hook their phone up to their car. There's just less choices in Orlando. So I think on the good side, at least for us, is if people really want music and they want a lot of music without a lot of chatter and interruptions, they can find it with our station. So that media consolidation and a lot of choices going away has worked in our favor, at least at WUCF. That's one of the changes, in addition to some of the negative things. For us, with the advent of podcasts and streaming music, it's really changed the game. Our donations come from all over the world now. We interact with people from all over the world with our podcasts. So those are some good things that we're enjoying now.
Scott, you had a long career with NPR in management and journalism and teaching, but you're focusing on jazz pretty much now. What made you move in that direction?
Well, actually, it ties into what Ed and Kayonne were talking about, because with all the changes in media and both the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the consolidation that happened out of the deregulation of '96, we've increasingly seen a loss of community in media. If you have a radio station, you are licensed to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. We are the only media outlet that people have the ability to get into that has that requirement. Cable TV doesn't have that requirement. Any streaming service doesn't have that requirement. Netflix doesn't have that requirement. And we're the only thing that's local anymore. Well, now that the world is everywhere, suddenly the meaning of being a local station is more powerful than ever. And I think for Ed, with Genesee Media, they're doubling down on local. Kayonne is doubling down on local. And for me in Pittsburgh, after the loss of a jazz and NPR station back, a dozen years ago, we saw there was an opportunity. So my volunteer job in my retirement now is the Pittsburgh Jazz Channel, and we're seeing remarkable success, but it's hard climbing uphill. And the one thing that Kayonne has, it's a big part of her success story, I think, is they've built up a brand over the last 2 decades. Building a brand is harder than ever now in this expansive media environment. And even having a brand doesn't mean anything if you can't make it sustainable. So I thought that journalism was going to figure itself out. A lot of other things that I've been involved with will figure themselves out. But jazz is probably the one platform that has the biggest challenge and also the biggest opportunity, because it connects with people more than anything else. And if we can help build those connections by using technology wisely, by using the sorts of things that I brought in my approaches to journalism wisely, I think we can tell the jazz story in local communities and across the country. And jazz needs more friends than ever. And now that there's no money in it, it's possibly the greatest time to grow bigger and stronger with relationships in our local communities and across the country. I'm fired up about what we can do. I have to admit it's exhausting at times, but it's really rewarding.
Ed, JazzWeek has become a major metric and influence for the jazz community. What's the reason to do a jazz chart for stations, hosts, and streamers?
Well, primarily so that artists and labels and the promoters who work for them can tell whether they're getting any traction with the product that they send out. When we started JazzWeek, it was in 2001, right after the Gavin report had stopped publishing a jazz chart, probably a year and a half before they went under completely. And there was a real cry right there. How do we know what people are playing? How do we measure the effectiveness of our promotion? How do other stations see what's being played around the country? And at an IAJE, the former International Association for Jazz Education convention, and I remember Scott being part of presentations on Radio Day the day before that convention started in that year. But there was a little bit of a rumor or a little hubbub going around that Gavin might stop doing it. And so I had begun some technical work to be able to do that. And so within about 4 weeks of Gavin going under, we started a chart, and it's been going since 2001. But really, it's about seeing how things are effective. One of the reasons you have promoters working records to jazz stations is because there is so much music out there. and labels, some of the larger labels. We really don't have major labels in jazz anymore. Larger labels really want to put an effort into that, knowing how things are going when they're promoting a record. And even smaller labels want to get their record seen through sort of the clutter or the avalanche of music. We have roughly, depending on the year, 600 to 700 releases that are submitted to us to be charted. So, if you do the math on that, that's 12 or 13 new releases a week. And when you take holiday time and so forth, when you don't, there's a whole bunch. And then there's digital and so forth. I remember talking to somebody who had been around since the days of LPs, and they said, we used to get maybe 20 LPs a month. Now we get 20 CDs a week. So there's just, since there is so much music out there, and since there are people doing promotion to try to get attention for artists and labels, you really need to have some system of measurement.
I get promo service from most of the major jazz labels, or larger jazz labels, as you put it, for my radio shows. I get more stuff than I can possibly listen to. I have to first make a decision, and sometimes I miss something that turns out to be a bigger deal than I expected. Even having said that, I sometimes can't listen to albums all the way through. I listen for specific tracks that I'm going to want to play. Your chart, do you chart albums or tracks or both?
We chart albums, mainly because it's still a manual reporting service. People log in and enter how many times they played a specific album. There was a stretch from about 2004 to 2012 when a company called Media Guide was on the scene as a subsidiary of ASCAP, and people would submit CD releases to them. They digitize them. They had hardware sitting in 125 markets and FM receivers that would take the audio into the computers, and they would log the airplay. It turned out to be economically unsustainable, and so that went away. And we've looked at the option of doing monitoring from streams using services that are out there, but even that is economically difficult. So we're continuing to look at options. There are companies out there looking to try to duplicate some of that, where what is played is automatically tabulated, because the work of entering in different tracks, let alone entering in spins from maybe 300 current releases, is really quite a bit of work.
Yeah, at my local radio station, we use Spinitron, and I don't have to enter it. The problem is every show they get one or two things wrong. Either they don't recognize it because it's not in their database, or they get the wrong artist who also recorded that same tune or whatever. And I'm tempted to go fix it. Does Spinitron go directly to you, or do you look at it?
No, I don't have access to it, and we're not connected to it. We build a prototype service to do monitoring, and the reason we didn't continue right now anyway, economically, is it was going to cost us about $3,000 a month to monitor the panel of stations. And nobody, we did a survey back in August, and everybody thought everybody else should pay for it. So that's kind of on the back burner right now, although there is something else I'm in discussion with some people on. But, not everybody uses Spinitron. That would be another thing that would have to happen. Stations would have to sign up with that and do it.
Scott.
Well, if I can double in on that, there's two different ways that Spinitron can report. One of them is the monitoring that Ed was kind of describing, and it's kind of like Shazam, where it listens to the cut and makes a pretty good guess 95% of the time on what it is you played. But it also, if you had a theme song in a promo, it would also count that, and would also sometimes get things totally wrong. The other way to make it more accurate is much more cumbersome, but really much more accurate. And really the way that stations should be doing it in an ideal world would be actually getting a feed directly off of the system you play your music from. Because hardly anybody, not I'm going to say hardly anybody, but most stations are in some way digitizing their play of what they put on the air. They're not playing from an LP anymore. Most stations, not all, but most. But that means you're putting in metadata, data about the data in the record that then produces a much more precise version of what comes out on Spinitron. And helps us keep a little bit more accurate measure. But there's a lot of work on the front end, and it means delaying when you can get music into your system by days, weeks, or even months, because everything has to be entered in. So there's no perfect solution here. The little secret about the music streams that you get from Pandora or Spotify or Apple Music is they're very limited in what they put in there because they have to have all the data in there about everything they play. That's possibly why listeners still come back to stations, because after a while, those other feeds run out of music and they're just regurgitating things over and over again. But technology has not been the solution for jazz. The people behind jazz have been the solution for jazz.
Dan, we mentioned earlier the importance of maintaining a community connection in this age of streaming and Sirius XM, et cetera. Could you elaborate a little more on that, the way you do that in Orlando?
It's the tried and true old radio way of doing it. We go out, we do events, we invite people into the station. We're fortunate that we're at the University of Central Florida, so we have a steady stream of students that are coming through the station, and we're sending them out to events. We're going to the festivals. We're doing those sorts of things. We try to interact with our listeners as much as possible, either through call-ins. My hot thing right now is I want to build a song rating page on our website, and we can invite people to like it or lose it. And that's my new hot item that I'm on, and we'll reward people with a prize or something each week, and because we don't have the money. A lot of commercial stations, they pay music research and they do all kinds of song testing and things. And so I'm really inspired to do that, because broadcasting is us to them. And how do we make it more interactive to where the community is giving us feedback? And so we're always searching for those ways. But the simple things that radio has always been doing, we just keep doing those things. And a lot of that went away during the pandemic because events went away and people just started working in their homes. But as soon as that opened back up, and it opened back up in Florida a lot sooner than it did in a lot of places, we just started going out to those events. Last weekend, we did a College Park Jazz Fest, and there were 4,000 people there. And we got to MC the stages and had our tent there. And we didn't invent this. It's literally in my textbook of the class that I teach. To be a part of the community, you've got to be out in the community.
During the pandemic, our station here in Portland was shut down for months. And a lot of people who had never done it before obtained the technology and started recording from home. And many of them are still doing that. I personally prefer to go in there and do it live. I think it's important to answer the phone, for one thing, if you get a call. Have you found that some of your programmers are still doing it pre-recorded digitally from home? And a related question, do your programmers, jazz programmers, how much individual discretion do they have on what they play? As the program director or the station manager, how much do you suggest a playlist and how much do they do on their own?
So we're completely playlisted. So they get a music log every day, and they have discretion. So if they get requests, I'm not always perfect. Maybe it's a jazz birthday that I forgot to include some music on it. They have discretion to change it. They're always I've got a host that's been around for a long, long time. He's always bringing in albums that he wants me to rip and put into the system. So they have some discretion. We use people that have been doing this professionally for years, and most of them have come from commercial radio. So they understand the benefit of sticking pretty much to a playlist, because it is cultivated and curated to flow nicely from song to song. So they don't deviate too far from it, but they have the freedom to do so.
Ed, Scott suggested this question. You're a media exec outside of the jazz realm. What's the state of play for local non-jazz radio?
Well, a lot of what Kayonne said holds true there too about being part of the community. Our company focuses on smaller markets, small towns, because the big players in radio pretty much own the medium and large markets. And again, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of this goes back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996 as ownership limits were peeled away. And you had companies that bought radio stations at the top of the market and are now saddled with enormous amounts of debt and cratering stock prices and having to cut back on staffs and so forth. When you hear that, you think the state of radio is really precarious. But when you look at small and medium markets and public radio too, I live in a market where public radio is expanding tremendously. In the smaller markets that serve their communities and serve local businesses if they're commercial through advertising and so forth, it's still pretty healthy. And I think that you can get a lot of encouragement from that, whether it's commercial or non-commercial radio. So because we're in a small market and we can also offer additional services like digital marketing and so forth as part of the package, we're very bullish on radio.
With all these streaming options, Spotify, Pandora, Apple, SiriusXM, certainly I think the amount of money that a non-commercial station like KBOO in Portland can expect to raise through a pledge drive is far less than it used to be. Fortunately, the station is surviving with other income streams. But how much future is there long run for what we call terrestrial radio?
That's the $1 million question right there.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. What do you think, Scott? I know you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, I think a lot of the damage that's happened to radio has been self-inflicted, both with the loading up of all that debt, but also just a lot of bad behavior. But that's been true of other businesses too. I noticed just today they announced, as we're doing this taping, that Jezebel, after 16 years of being an active website, is shutting down because they can't find a buyer for it. I think the future for any media right now is going to be finding what your sustainable footprint is. And technology allows you to live within that. But you're going to have a vision and a purpose and a brand and a reason for people to love you. That's always been the case. Now, when there were only a handful of radio stations, there were only 3 TV stations and PBS in a market, we had a license to print money in media. Now it's harder. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it also means it's not easy. But 20 years ago, when we were leading groups of jazz radio stations in discussions like Ed was talking about, I always wanted to make sure people were aware that they needed to serve the listeners in the community first. And, making the connection with the music and the artists and the listeners is really the role that we can succeed at. But if you ignore what the audience is telling you, whether it's in ratings or in phone calls or in messages, you're actually damaging jazz and you're damaging your station. Because, we are not an island here. The fact that we can be more interactive than ever means we need to really take advantage of those tools. But that also means your station has to be powerful and your website has to be powerful. If you're using social media as your only way to reach your community, Facebook owns you. Instagram owns you. If it doesn't originate from you, but you're putting it on another platform, they're getting all the revenue that you're making happen there. So, we just have to be a little bit more protective of our missions, but also clarify what our missions are. But I think that's true of our commercial radio friends. I've been in this business a long time, and it breaks my heart to see what happened to some great stations, TV and radio and networks over the past couple of decades because the leadership took their eye off the ball.
And if I could add just something about both of the stations represented here by Kayonne and Scott, these are both stations who understand jazz as a living art form, and they program a significant amount of current music, letting people know that there are new artists and new releases and maybe new directions in jazz to listen to. And I think that's really important too, not to treat jazz as a museum piece, but as one of the lively and living arts.
Well, thank you, Ed. But one of the other things is, and sometimes my friends who are record promoters, when I tell them that the Blues and Heritage Festival is happening right now, or the Pittsburgh International Jazz Festival is happening around, or a lot of other things are going on, we're not going to be focusing as much on new releases from around the country. We focus on Pittsburgh first. And that also included what we do with our Jazz Central calendar. There's more than a couple hundred live jazz events going on every month here, and we are the one reliable conveyor of that information. We gather it up from everywhere we can, because clubs and presenters and artists are not always very good at letting people know where they're playing. So
Sure.
we play that intervener role as fairly as we can to make sure everybody knows what's going on. But that's a lot of work. But our listeners also appreciate it, and so do the performers, and even the venues appreciate it. But that's part of the work that you have to do to be a local station, because no one in New Jersey is going to care about what's going on in Pittsburgh. And that's okay, because the people in Pittsburgh aren't so concerned about what's going on in New Jersey either. But there are things nationally that we can all be concerned about or interested in. But, where you live matters now more than ever, because that's where you live. And that's something that radio can do because it's part of our charter.
On my program, Jazz in the New Millennium, I define it as I'm trying to define a modern mainstream in the music that I play. But in 2023, that can include everything from post-comeback Miles Davis and Marcus Miller to the edge of the avant-garde. It doesn't just mean Oscar Peterson, although I play Oscar Peterson too. Well, I don't really, because he's not a living jazz artist. But if he's playing with somebody who is a living jazz artist, I might play Oscar Peterson. So how does JazzWeek focuses on straight ahead jazz? Where do you draw the line? Chris Bodie has a new album out on Blue Note. Is that going to get
It's on there.
played classified in JazzWeek?
Yeah, we pretty much draw the line at what people submit to be tracked, because that's music they're sending out to stations. The new Chris Bodie on Blue Note is there. It's having a little resistance getting onto the chart, but it's on there. I think that maybe the delineation is smooth jazz and not getting in there. And, I know it when I hear it, but I'm not also gatekeeping. Some people will try to do that. But I'm really excited about a lot of the different sounds that I'm hearing these days. You've got young artists that are incorporating other music. There's been a little bit of hip hop influence in jazz. One release that stands out to me this year that I thought sounded so fresh and did make it to #1 on JazzWeek was Alfredo Rodriguez's Choral Way. Just fun, and some vocals in there, and little classical influence, and certainly the Cuban influence. I think music like that sounds so fresh and exciting, and really makes the genre and makes the station sound great.
Yeah. We're a little bit insulated in our world. We're the super jazz heads. We love this stuff. And one of the reasons why I'm so hot on a music rating thing that we can ask our audience to weigh in on is what I like, what you like. Do you feel the same way about this? And I'm going to make it real simple. Like it or lose it. There's no in between, because that's what they do when they're listening to the radio. They're either, oh yeah, they love it. They get out of the car, they tell their wife about it when they go in the house, or they go, boop, and they're on a different channel. So it's really important. It's more important now than ever with all of our competition that everything we play, it's not going to please everybody, but hopefully it's not going to make a bunch of people going, boop, and hitting that button.
And
Yeah.
Kayonne brought up a good point there too, just quickly, is that you're not programming the stations for the real hardcore jazz fans. That's why sometimes you see things rated differently in print reviews as opposed to what gets played on the radio. You have a small core of hardcore fans, the P1s they call in the radio business. And then you have people who are kind of generally jazz fans. Then you may have people who either just know they like what they hear, or maybe like to support public radio. So you have to make sure that you serve all of those audiences and not just a narrow spectrum of it, or else you're not going to be able to maintain your station.
Yeah, as a music critic, a longtime music critic, as well as a jazz radio programmer, there is music I appreciate as a critic that I have to be very careful about playing it. Not only because I don't want to lose a listener, I don't want to lose a station. I don't want some program director to tune in and go, what is this? And that can mean Ornette Coleman, or that can mean James Brandon Lewis has a new album out of the music of Mahalia Jackson, which is probably more accessible than some of his other albums, but it's still not all that accessible. It sounds like Albert Ayler playing Mahalia Jackson. And maybe that's modern mainstream, but maybe it isn't. So yeah, I have to draw a distinction, but you're right. There is so much good music out there, more than I can remember. Maybe it's not better than Miles and Mingus and Monk, but it's creatively thriving, right? And you're tracking new releases and playing new releases. They're not getting on SiriusXM's Real Jazz either very often, that I hear. They work mostly out of a classic playbook. How is it that this music continues to thrive even while nightclubs are closing, record labels are folding, radio stations are changing their formats or going out of business? How does this music keep going?
Well, remember, it's also a big part of our American and African American diaspora. There's history behind it. There's culture behind it. There's a lot of reason why jazz exists in this world and in this country. And it's not just by getting spins. But that's where I drill back down to local, because the thing about being local is you connect with people. And when you build together people, then you build community. And I think that's probably the most important thing that radio stations can do. And that's where actually the narrative of the music you're playing, you don't want to be going on lectures, but there is a story behind what you're playing and why. And a lot of what I try to do when I'm hosting now is try to give an insight into why we're playing this, as opposed to just because I like it. There's a good story behind almost every Clark Terry record. There's a good story behind Justin Coughlin. If you can intone some of that and share it, and also encourage people to check out the documentary about him and Clark Terry. There's lots of good stories out there that can get people interested. That's part of the reason why jazz endures, because it is a music of pulling people together. And as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said at the Jazz Congress a few years ago, making the perfect out of the imperfect. And, it's an evolving American story that we get to be a part of every day in our radio stations, and that the artists are doing every day in their work and their art.
Any other closing thoughts?
I think Scott said it really well right there. The only other thing I would say is this music is deep and it's also fun. It'll get you thinking and it'll get you moving. And I think that never goes out of style.
It's a good name for an album, Deep Fun. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Ed Trefizger and Kayonne Riley and Scott Handley on the state of jazz radio. I'm Rick Mitchell. Thank you for listening to The Buzz, a podcast produced by the Jazz Journalists Association. We release new episodes monthly on all the major platforms. To hear more about us, go to jjanews.org. This episode was edited by Wiz Petta. The John Michaels composition Big Vic is our theme music. Peace.